He thought the past was buried. He thought the ghosts of his wife and son were gone forever. But some shadows, they never stay down. Today, a storm comes across the plains, and a man who has waited 20 years will face the enemy he thought he'd left behind. Watch closely, because once this reckoning begins, there's no turning back. I can still feel the wind before I see the dust. It rolls across the prairie like a warning, a living thing, whispering in tones only I seem to understand. I've walked these lands for 20 years, yet the prairie has never been forgiving, never kind. They call me a rancher now, but the title is empty. I keep cattle, not enemies. The scars in my back, the ones no man saw but I can feel every time the sun sets, remind me I am still the same man who once bled under a sky filled with fire and smoke. The cabin is quiet this evening, more silent than usual, a kind of stillness that unsettles even the horses in the corral. I notice it first in the twitch of their tails, the way their ears flick like they're listening for something beyond my own hearing. I remember the last time a silence like this fell over my land, the night the raiders came, the night everything I loved was stripped from me. My wife, my son, buried under cold dirt and cold stones. No words could mark their graves. Nothing left to say. That's when the stagecoach appeared over the ridge. Dust and wheels first, and then the driver, shifting nervously, his hands white around the reins. He doesn't look at me. He knows the stories, I think. Or maybe he can feel the kind of calm that isn't calm. He stops the horses at the gate, doesn't knock. I watch, silent as the wind, as the back door opens. 2 girls step down, barely women, chained, their clothes dusty, their eyes wide and old beyond their years. Apache, I recognize immediately. Not by the clothes, not by the language, but by the way they hold themselves, as if the weight of every wrong done to them already exists in their spines. My name is unspoken. They don't need to know it. I am the man who survived the fire, the man who survived the men who killed everything I loved. I am Cade. The driver hands me a letter, sealed in red wax, the name pressed into it, Hollis Brentwood. I know that name. A snake in silk, a man whose gold is only matched by his cruelty. He writes to repay a kindness I offered months ago. The letter makes no apologies for the horror it contains. These girls are his gift, he says, obedient and knowing their place. I read the words, then stare at the chains. One girl trembles, the other lifts her chin. There's defiance there, buried under fear, and it is enough. I step forward, silent as shadow. The chains clink softly against the dry earth, a sound that will haunt me. I do not touch them, I do not speak. The house waits, as it has for decades, for nothing, for me, for the echoes of a life that should have ended long ago. I bring them inside. That night I cook rabbit, the smell of it filling the small cabin, and I place 3 bowls on the table. I cut the shackles with a chisel, laying the links in the drawer I swore I would never open again. Eat, I say. You are not property here. They do, silently, eyes watching more closely than fear allows. There's a subtle shift, almost imperceptible, in the air. The house breathes again, but it is a cautious breath. I can see it in their movements, learning to trust, inch by inch, despite the weight of the past pressing on every one of us. The days after are strange. Strange because nothing happens. No enemies, no bullets, no fire, no screams. Just peace. I name them Luma and T. I teach them the fields, how to ride, the rhythm of caring for cattle. They sleep in the next room, safe, though they do not fully understand it yet. The silence is almost a test. I am quiet. They are quiet. The world outside the cabin does not intrude. Not yet. One evening, The wind dies. The horses refuse to settle. Sleep eludes me. I lie awake staring at shadows that stretch across the ceiling like fingers, reaching for the memory I keep buried deeper than the graves behind the house. And then I hear it, soft, low voices, trembling behind a wall, whispering, not to me, but as if my presence matters, as if it can save or doom them all. He's not like we thought, a voice says. Luma. He's kind. He didn't even look at us the way other men do. But Papa and Mama will die if we fail, T whispers back. The words slice through me, sharper than any blade. My chest tightens. I can taste the old nights, the blood-soaked earth, the fire, the smoke, the gunpowder, the scream of a child, my son. I rise slowly, hands brushing against the rifle, the revolvers, the scars of memory that have never left me. I step into the hall. The girls turn, expecting rage, expecting a bullet. Instead, I am calm, silent, watching, waiting. The past is not dead. It has only waited. The first night I spent watching them, I realized how fragile trust could be, how easily it could crumble beneath fear. T and Luma slept in the other room, though sleep didn't come easily to either of them. I could hear every sigh, every breath, every small shuffle as if the house itself recorded it all. I had learned to live in silence long ago, each sound a potential threat. And yet, this silence was different. It wasn't filled with menace. It was heavy with expectation, with unspoken questions about survival, loyalty, and the past that refused to die. I thought of Brentwood constantly, the man whose wealth was matched only by cruelty. I remembered the first time I had seen him, long ago, before he had cemented his empire with gold and blood. A snake in a silk suit, charming, polite, deadly. He had smiled that same smile when he handed the girl's parents over to me months before, a promise hidden in deception. I had not understood it at the time. Now, I did. The girls, Luma and T, were more than survivors. They were warriors of quiet strength, shaped by fire and loss I knew all too well. Luma moved through the fields with a grace that reminded me of my wife before the night of the massacre, before the fire, before the silence settled in my soul like ash in a jar. T's eyes, however, held calculation. She watched, measured, always aware of the balance between threat and opportunity. I recognized that look immediately. It was the same one I'd carried for 20 years, the one that told anyone watching I was never to be underestimated. The next morning I took them to the stables, showing them the paths through the land, the hidden spots where the cattle wandered, the low ridges that offered sightlines over the surrounding plains. I could see them absorbing everything, their eyes scanning the horizon, their bodies learning the rhythm of the land. It was the first time in decades I felt a flicker of something close to hope. Hope, yes, though it was thin and fragile, like the first light of dawn over a snow-covered ridge. The memory of my family hit me harder than it had in years. I remembered my wife's laughter before it was silenced, the small boots of my son echoing across the cabin floor. That night, I had fought men who had no name, men who had no face beyond the black masks they wore, men who had turned my life into a graveyard. And yet, the one man who had escaped, one scarred, bloodied man, had returned, not with revenge, but with a trap. Brentwood had waited 20 years for me to soften, for the lines of grief to dull the sharp edges I had honed in blood. I prepared quietly, alone in the barn. Each tool, each weapon, each shot lined with memory, meticulous as the carving of a coffin. I cleaned my revolvers until they gleamed, polished the Winchester until the metal shone against the lantern light. The boxes, the maps, the secrets of the past, all weighed heavier than the barrels I held in my hands. T approached me the following night, hesitant, as if testing the weight of my silence. Her eyes met mine, and I saw fear, yes, but also determination. I knew then she understood. This was not a game. This was a reckoning. Luma followed shortly after, quieter, softer, but just as sharp in her resolve. I realized they had already made their choice. They would fight alongside me, not as pawns, not as victims, but as allies shaped by the same fire that had forged me into the man I was. We moved cautiously in the days that followed. The girls learned the land, the paths, the vantage points. I watched them practice, noting how Luma kept her movements fluid, how T measured every step, every glance, every shadow. They became extensions of the same watchful eye I had carried alone for 20 years. For the first time, I felt the stirrings of a plan that could work. A plan that did not rely solely on bullets, but on patience, cunning, and the knowledge that the past always leaves traces. Brentwood was coming. I could feel it. The letters, the messages, the calculated steps, all of them led to this. The box, the trap, the temptation of wealth and power. He believed he could manipulate fear, that he could bend us to his will, that the ghosts of 20 years could finally be laid to rest by his silk-covered hands. He was wrong, and so we waited. The prairie stretched around us, dry and harsh, winds carrying whispers of memory and blood. Each night, I traced the lines of my scars, remembering every swing of the knife, every gunshot, every scream that had shaped the man I had become. Luma and T, unaware of the full depth of the past, yet fully present in its consequences, watched, learned, and prepared. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of fire and blood, I finally spoke. Not to them, not aloud, but to the wind that carried the ghosts of the past across the plains. "It ends soon," I said. The words hung in the air, a promise, a warning, a reckoning, and for the first time in 20 years, I felt the weight of vengeance stir like a living thing within me, ready to move, ready to strike. The box was hidden. The land was prepared. The girls were ready. And I, the man who had survived fire, blood, and betrayal, waited for the first sign that Brentwood's greed would bring him into the open. The prairie changed the way shadows moved, and I knew the land like a map etched in bone. Every ridge, every dry gully, every patch of scrub grass was familiar. It was the same land that had swallowed my family, that had become both a graveyard and a fortress, a place where death and survival were inseparable. I spent the morning walking along the ridges, counting the horses in the corral, noting the line of the horizon. Each detail mattered. Brentwood believed that greed would make him predictable, but I had learned to read the men who thought themselves untouchable. T and Luma had grown accustomed to the rhythm of the ranch. They moved silently, carrying buckets, checking the fences, learning the horses' temperaments. But I noticed their eyes flicking to the horizon, scanning for signs that the silk-clad devil was on his way. I saw it first in T's hand, how she rested on the hilt of a hidden blade, her knuckles white beneath the leather gloves she refused to take off. Luma's movements were quieter, almost fluid, like water slipping through rocks, her mind always calculating, her body ready for sudden action. They were not children anymore. They were extensions of a long-buried force I had kept alive for 20 years. The first letter arrived at dusk. A simple note, carefully folded, sealed with the mark of Brentwood's crest. Luma brought it to me, her fingers trembling slightly as she handed it over. I did not read it aloud. I didn't need to. The contents were obvious. The man believed the girls had found the box. He believed they were desperate enough to play along, to give him what he wanted. The trap was set, and I would use it against him. The box, I reminded myself, was not where he thought it was. It lay beneath the floorboards of the old barn, wrapped in oilskin and weighted with iron. The real contents, a map, folded and fragile, the ink faded from decades of neglect, waited quietly, a secret I alone had kept alive. In its place, we would use a decoy, a rusted tin filled with rocks and wrapped in old leather. It was simple, yet elegant. It was bait. I spent the afternoon in the barn, checking every corner, every shadow. The rifle was cleaned, the revolvers polished until the metal gleamed like frozen light. I moved silently, methodical, my mind tracing every possible path Brentwood might take, every angle he might exploit. I imagined him standing over the decoy, greed in his eyes, arrogance in his posture. And I imagined the moment when reality would crash into him like a stampede, like the fire that had once swallowed my home. T approached me that evening, quieter than usual. Her eyes met mine briefly, and I knew she understood the stakes. I did not speak. Words would have betrayed the plan, the readiness, the patience that had been honed like a blade in silence. Luma joined her a few moments later, carrying a satchel over her shoulder, dust smudging her cheek. They were ready to play their parts, to be the lure, to move with the precision of the wind over the prairie. I felt a spark of something I hadn't felt in years. Trust. Not blind trust, but trust forged in necessity, in shared survival. Night fell slowly, the kind of night that presses against your skin, heavy with the scent of dust and the faint tang of blood that lingers long after violence has passed. I positioned myself on the ridge, overlooking the basin where I predicted Brentwood would appear. My scope rested against my cheek, fingers steady despite the tension that hummed like a low current through the air. Every shadow, every rustle of dry grass, every whisper of the wind became a signal. My heartbeat slowed. 20 years of silence, of planning, of vengeance, had led to this. Hours passed. The prairie whispered secrets I alone could hear. The horses shifted, ears flicking, tails swishing. The girls had already reached their positions, carrying the decoy box exactly where Brentwood would expect it. I watched as Luma crouched behind a boulder, her small frame barely visible in the moonlight. T moved like a shadow, carrying the burden of their parents' survival on her shoulders. Every step they took was a rehearsal in precision, a dance that had taken days of quiet training to perfect. Brentwood would arrive, I knew, and when he did, he would reveal the true measure of greed, of arrogance, of underestimating a man who had survived fire, blood, and betrayal. I could see it now, the first signs of dust rising on the distant ridge, a movement too calculated to be random. The devil in silk had come to claim his prize. The stage was set, and for the first time in decades, I felt the tension of inevitability, the kind that comes only when the past and present collide with deadly precision. I adjusted my rifle, feeling the cold metal against my cheek. The revolvers rested within easy reach, gleaming under the pale moonlight. I watched the shadows, the ridge lines, the valley floor. The wind shifted, carrying a scent of leather, horses, and the faint perfume of arrogance. Brentwood had arrived. He would soon learn that patience, cunning, and the weight of 20 years of grief could be more lethal than any bullet fired in anger. The first flicker of movement caught my eye just as the stars bled into the horizon. Dust trailed behind figures, calculated, precise, betraying the careful pacing of a man who believed he commanded the land. Brentwood's silhouette appeared first, a black duster brushing against the twilight, silver-handled cane glinting faintly in the dying light. I didn't move. I didn't breathe more than necessary. 20 years of practice had taught me that patience was the deadliest weapon. The girls were already in position, their bodies pressed low behind boulders, eyes trained on the open basin where the decoy box lay hidden beneath layers of dirt and old leather. Luma's hands were steady as she adjusted the satchel, making sure it looked convincingly heavy. T crouched beside her, the knife she had hidden in her boot now ready, fingers tracing the hilt with a silent precision that belied her youth. They were more than accomplices. They were extensions of me, trained in silence, shaped by necessity, carrying the weight of their parents' survival and the lessons of our shared history. I watched as Brentwood's men advanced first, 4 of them, pale and precise, each step calculated to intimidate and assert dominance. They had been trained to expect obedience, to assume fear would guide every motion. They would find neither. I adjusted my rifle scope, tracing the contours of the rocks and ridges, memorizing every shadow, every hidden angle. If they made a single wrong step, I knew it would cost them. I had become an extension of the land itself, a ghost among the cliffs and scrub grass, and I knew how to use every curve and slope to my advantage. Brentwood's approach was deliberate, his cane tapping against the ground like the heartbeat of arrogance. He thought himself untouchable, a predator with wealth and cunning as his shields. He had underestimated the measure of grief that had shaped me, the patience that had sharpened my mind and hands like steel. I had lived with fire in my chest for 2 decades, fire that now burned hotter than ever. The first confrontation was subtle, almost imperceptible. One of his men stepped too close to the decoy box, and I marked it silently. My finger hovered on the trigger, a shadow of anticipation across my vision. Before he could reach the box, a single shot rang out, a warning etched in gunpowder. He fell backward, rifle clattering against the stones. Panic rippled through the group. Brentwood's eyes widened, but his composure remained. He had not expected resistance this early, not precision this lethal. The chaos was swift. 2 more of his men moved forward, only to be met with precision shots. Each movement was deliberate, calculated, a chess game played with blood and steel. I stayed hidden, letting the terrain and the element of surprise do the work, but my heart beat steadily, the rhythm of preparation meeting execution. Luma and T moved silently among the chaos, cutting ropes, dragging their parents to safety, every motion measured, every step rehearsed. Brentwood's fury was contained, restrained, until he realized the box he sought was false. His lips curled into a snarl as he approached, silver cane tapping against stone, eyes scanning for the girls. He believed control was still possible. It wasn't. The decoy had done its work. Greed had blinded him. I marked him through the scope, noting the flash of arrogance in his stance, the predictability of his greed. He thought the decoy was the real prize, that he could coerce compliance through threat. But the basin was a theater, every angle, every shadow, every echo accounted for. I had turned patience into an instrument of justice. T's movement was a whisper, unseen until it was too late. The knife she had hidden struck true, planting fear into the heart of a man who had known only control. Luma's voice carried just enough to bait him toward the false box, her presence a silent threat of the violence he had ignored. Each step he took brought him closer to the edge, the trap closing not with chains, but with the inevitability of his own hubris. The night itself seemed to conspire against him. Winds shifted, carrying dust and the scent of iron. The prairie echoed with the sounds of struggle, of men unprepared for the measure of skill, patience, and vengeance they faced. Brentwood was no longer the predator. He was the mark, every step a testament to the consequences of underestimating those he had wronged. And in the quiet moments between shots, I felt the weight of the past, the long shadow of grief, the lessons etched into every scar. I had waited 20 years for this, not for vengeance alone, but for closure, for justice. The girls, now more than survivors, were witnesses and participants, shaping the final act with courage, precision, and resolve. By the time the last shot rang out, silence returned, not peace, but the heavy calm after a storm. Brentwood lay defeated, the decoy revealed, his greed and cruelty stripped away by strategy and patience. Dust settled over the basin, over the scattered bodies, and over the echoes of a reckoning 20 years in the making. I lowered my rifle slowly, my eyes scanning the horizon. Luma and T emerged from the shadows, their parents safe, their movements steady, their expressions unreadable but full of a quiet victory. The night air carried the scent of fire, blood, and the faint, lingering tang of justice served. For the first time in decades, I exhaled fully, knowing that the reckoning was not only complete, but precise. The basin was quiet now, save for the wind and the rustling of dry brush. I stepped forward, surveying the aftermath, my thoughts already tracing the steps that would follow. The past had collided with the present, and for the first time, I saw the edges of the long shadow begin to fade. The night was far from over, though the initial chaos had claimed its due. Brentwood lay sprawled across the basin floor, his silver cane thrown aside, the glint of the moon catching the brass of his belt buckle as if mocking him. But I knew better. Defeating him physically was only part of the reckoning. The Rayol work required patience, precision, and foresight. One wrong move, and the tables could turn. One slip, and the price for the girls, their parents, and even myself could be paid in blood. I scanned the basin carefully. The decoy box lay half buried in the sand, and though it had served its purpose, it remained a symbol of the trap. I had anticipated Brentwood's every movement, the way greed would guide his feet, the way arrogance would blind him to the danger around him. I had counted on his men, his loyalty as shallow as the riverbeds in spring, to falter when faced with fear and unpredictability. The girls moved swiftly, silently, gathering their parents and keeping them low to the ground. Luma's eyes, sharp and calculating, never left the perimeter, and T's hands were ready on the weapons I had distributed in secret. They were no longer children in chains. They were agents of their own survival, their parents' lives dependent on the actions they had taken with courage and cunning beyond their years. Brentwood stirred. I noticed the subtle shift, the twitch of his fingers, the narrowing of his eyes. He had realized, at last, that the prize he sought was a lie. He had underestimated the depth of our preparation, and yet he still thought he could reverse the tide, that he could manipulate chaos into his favor. Pride, as always, would be his undoing. I approached the edge of my vantage, rifle resting across my knees, revolvers ready. The night carried the scent of iron, dust, and desperation. Every shadow, every rock, every rustle of dry grass was now a part of the stage we had built. The wind shifted, whispering through the basin, carrying with it the scent of fire and earth, and Brentwood's awareness of danger had sharpened to a dangerous degree. But even then, he had not anticipated the precision, the patience, the relentless certainty that only years of loss and preparation could cultivate. The first sound came from the ridge above, the soft click of a trigger, the hum of tension in the air, the silent signal that action was imminent. Brentwood rose slightly, defiance in his posture, but hesitation flickered in his gaze. He had counted on predictability. What he found was a meticulously orchestrated trap. My aim was steady, my breathing controlled, every sense attuned to the land, the shadows, the inevitable. Luma and T had positioned themselves perfectly. The rope cutting, the satchel dropping, the parents moving, all of it had been rehearsed in silence, executed with deadly efficiency. Their presence was the proof that preparation and courage could outweigh power and wealth. They were not pawns. They were weapons, living embodiments of strategy shaped by necessity. Brentwood's attempt to seize the decoy was futile. The moment he touched it, he realized the futility, the lie, the measure of the trap. Panic surged through his eyes as he understood that the golden prize he had envisioned was nothing more than a shadow, a tease. He reached for his men, but they had already been neutralized, scattered across the basin, undone by a combination of anticipation, skill, and fear. The wind shifted again, carrying a whisper of threat, and I moved into the next stage. Silence and patience had bought me the perfect moment. I advanced slowly, deliberately, feet finding purchase on the rocky terrain, revolvers at the ready, my eyes fixed on Brentwood's every movement. He tried to flee, but the terrain was familiar to me in ways it could never be to him. Every ridge, every rock, every shadow had been counted, anticipated, planned for decades. The girls were steady. Their parents were low, protected, and aware of the fragile balance between freedom and catastrophe. T's grip tightened on her blade. Luma's satchel weighed down convincingly with the decoy. The final confrontation was imminent, and I could feel the tension in the air, thick as the dust that had settled over the basin. Brentwood's arrogance faltered, his pulse quickened, and he finally realized that control had slipped entirely from his grasp. The land itself had become an ally, shadows and rocks conspiring with patience and strategy to dismantle his perceived power. I could see it in his eyes. Fear, the first true fear he had known in decades. I lowered my rifle, taking careful aim, but the final act was not yet complete. He would have one last chance, a final choice between life and death, between submission and defiance. The basin held its breath, the night silent except for the soft rustle of wind, the distant cry of a hawk, and the echo of inevitability. Brentwood had met the reckoning he had long evaded, and there would be no escape, no manipulation, no last trick. The trap, crafted over decades, was about to be sealed. The basin had grown quiet, but the night had not yet surrendered its secrets. Shadows lingered like memories, twisting across the rocks and scorched earth, carrying the residue of fear and desperation. I remained hidden, eyes locked on Brentwood as he staggered to his feet, disbelief painting his features. Every calculation he had made, every plan he had devised, had unraveled in the space of a heartbeat. The decoy box lay near his boots, dirt smeared and false, yet heavier with the weight of his failure than any treasure he had ever held. I watched him carefully, noting the tremor in his hands, the tension in his shoulders. The silver cane he relied on as a symbol of authority now seemed absurd, a relic of power he could no longer command. His men were scattered, 2 lying unconscious, the other 2 nursing wounds that would remind them of our presence long after the night ended. The horizon was painted with dust and moonlight, revealing every ridge, every contour I had memorized, every shadow I could manipulate. The girls moved swiftly, dragging their parents to cover behind a large boulder that jutted from the center of the basin. Luma adjusted the burlap sack to ensure the decoy box looked convincingly real from any angle, while T's eyes remained sharp, scanning for movement that could threaten the fragile advantage we held. They had been molded by fear and necessity, yet now they operated with a controlled precision that few men possessed. Brentwood made the first move, a desperate lunge toward the decoy. His arrogance had blinded him to the danger that lingered just out of sight. The second I saw his motion, I reacted, though slowly, deliberately, like a predator stalking prey in the long shadow of dusk. One precise shot rang out, the sound echoing across the basin, and Brentwood collapsed to one knee, clutching at nothing but the revelation of his vulnerability. His face contorted with rage and fear, but he had already lost the ability to dictate the terms of the encounter. I advanced along the ridge, moving cautiously, letting my rifle guide the flow of power. I was patient, knowing that every moment he remained unaware of the trap's totality was a moment in which justice could manifest itself fully. The wind carried the faint scent of iron and dust, the unmistakable promise of consequence that I had learned to wield over 2 decades of solitude and preparation. Luma stepped forward, her presence deliberate, her movements slow, measured, guiding Brentwood's attention toward the false prize. T flanked her, a silent guardian, a blade hidden and ready, her gaze steady, unflinching. Their parents were safely crouched behind the rock, oblivious to the fine choreography unfolding before them, relying entirely on our strategy and courage to survive. Brentwood's breathing grew ragged, the realization of deceit dawning too late. He had underestimated patience, underestimated the subtle power of silence and observation honed over 20 long years. His steps faltered, each movement betraying fear. The basin, once a stage for his control, had become a cage, and the predator had become the prey. I moved closer, lowering my rifle but keeping it trained on him, every motion deliberate. Brentwood's eyes darted between me, the girls, the decoy, the empty spaces where his men had fallen. He understood, finally, that his wealth and cunning were meaningless against the combination of strategy, patience, and the precision of those who had lived with loss long enough to transform it into power. The first words he spoke were measured, cautious, a plea for negotiation. I ignored him. Words could not undo years of cruelty, nor could they unravel the careful orchestration of justice that had been prepared in silence. The girls took their positions, guiding the parents to a more secure location, ensuring that no corner of the basin offered him leverage. I could feel the culmination of decades of anticipation coiling in my chest. Every scar, every wound, every loss had led to this precise moment. The wind shifted again, carrying the faintest whisper of desert chill, and Brentwood's pride began to crumble. He lunged toward the box once more, and in that instant I stepped from my cover, revolvers ready, and aimed directly at the center of his chest. He froze, eyes wide, the silver cane falling from his hands. The girl's movements had drawn him fully into the trap, and I had led him there with patience that only decades of survival could teach. The basin held its breath, the night suspended in anticipation. One last moment, one last chance to recognize the inevitability of his defeat. And then I fired. The shot rang true, echoing across the rocks, striking not only a target but the culmination of a life spent waiting for justice. Brentwood's body collapsed, inert, the decoy box at his feet. Dust and shadow mingled around him, marking the end of a reign built on cruelty and greed. Silence returned, heavier than before, thick with the weight of survival and victory. The girls approached cautiously, checking their parents and ensuring the basin was secure. Luma's hands were steady as she placed a reassuring touch on the burlap sack. T's eyes scanned the horizon one last time before settling on Brentwood's fallen form. Together, they had participated in shaping the final act, their courage and precision ensuring that the past had been acknowledged, confronted, and conquered. I stood over Brentwood, revolvers lowering slowly, eyes tracing the faintest glint of moonlight on the basin. The reckoning was complete. 20 years of waiting, enduring, surviving, and preparing had led to this precise outcome. The basin was silent now, save for the faint rustle of the wind, carrying the echoes of vengeance, strategy, and justice served with patience and precision. The basin had quieted, but silence does not bring peace. It is heavy, weighted with the residue of fear, rage, and survival. I lowered my revolvers, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease ever so slightly, though not completely. 20 years of waiting, watching, planning, and enduring had culminated in this single, fragile night. The bodies sprawled across the sand told a story of reckoning, yet they were only part of it. The rest, what remained in the hearts of those who had suffered, what lingered in the spaces between shadow and memory, was far less tangible, far more enduring. Luma and T were helping their parents stand, their hands steady, their movements careful, as though afraid to disturb the fragile equilibrium that now existed. I observed from my position near the ridge, surveying the basin, the rocks, the bodies, and the horizon. Every detail mattered. Every detail had been planned, anticipated, exploited. Yet now, as the moon cast long silver shadows across the basin floor, I realized that survival was only the beginning. The aftermath required vigilance, strategy, and unbroken focus. The parents clung to each other, bruised and shaking, yet alive. Their eyes met mine across the distance, gratitude unspoken, recognition of effort and protection implicit. They had been pawns in Brentwood's game, but they had survived, and their survival now became my responsibility to manage, to shield, to protect. Every action I had taken, every decision I had made over 2 decades, had led to this tenuous restoration of life and order. Luma approached first, careful and deliberate. She placed the burlap sack containing the decoy box on the sand and stepped back. Her eyes met mine with a mixture of relief, calculation, and something I had not expected. Admiration, yes, but tempered by the knowledge that survival demanded more than admiration. It demanded constant awareness. T remained close, a blade sheathed at her side, her gaze sweeping the horizon, unblinking, unyielding. They had been my protégés, my partners in execution, but now they were something more. Catalysts of resolution, the living proof that strategy could be taught and executed under the most extreme conditions. I descended into the basin cautiously, revolvers now sheathed, yet my senses remaining acutely alert. The air smelled of dust, gunpowder, and iron, a scent that would remain in my memory far longer than I wished. The bodies of Brentwood's men lay strewn in positions that mirrored chaos, yet had been orchestrated with precision. Each shadow they had fled through had been accounted for. Each movement they made had been anticipated. Even in death or incapacitation, their presence told a story of consequence and preparation. The girl's parents were guided to a safe spot beneath a rock outcrop, where they could rest and recover, their movements slow and careful. Luma ensured the burlap sack remained convincingly placed, though I knew the decoy's presence was now symbolic rather than functional. T's eyes never left the horizon. Even after the threat had been neutralized, the vigilance of survival lingered in her posture, in the tilt of her head, in the tension of her fingers. They had learned, and I had taught them, that survival demanded attention long after the battle was won. I knelt beside the decoy box, opening it with care. Inside, I found the rocks and parchment I had selected meticulously. No gold, no jewels, no promises of wealth, only the illusion, the bait that had drawn Brentwood and his men into the trap. I allowed myself a moment to reflect. Justice had been served, but the real reward was far subtler. The preservation of life, the safeguarding of innocence, and the assertion that patience, preparation, and relentless focus could triumph over greed, cruelty, and arrogance. The basin itself seemed to exhale, as though the earth recognized the closure of a story that had lingered for too long. Dust rose from the rocks in small motes, catching the moonlight, creating a shimmering haze over the landscape. The wind shifted, carrying faint echoes of past violence, of screams and gunfire, now softened into whispers that spoke of reckoning completed. Luma and T moved closer, their presence quiet but commanding. They had participated fully in shaping the events of the night, and their understanding of consequence was now absolute. Every movement, every action, every decision had mattered. There was no room for error, no place for hesitation, and no margin for failure. Their parents, for the first time in many years, allowed themselves to breathe deeply, unafraid that the next moment would bring death or chaos. I stood slowly, observing the basin and the horizon. The night had yielded its verdict. Brentwood was defeated, his plans unraveled, his power extinguished. The girl's parents were safe, the basin silent but for the rustle of wind through the dry brush. The decoy box lay at my feet, a reminder of strategy and patience, a tangible representation of decades of endurance, planning, and survival. Yet even in this moment, I knew the night was not fully done. Shadows lingered, both literal and figurative. The land held its secrets tightly, and the weight of past loss still pressed against my chest. 20 years had brought grief, solitude, and the unrelenting pursuit of justice. Tonight, that justice had been realized, yet it came with a price. Vigilance, survival, protection, and awareness could never be abandoned. I guided the families back toward the rim of the basin, every step deliberate, every movement calculated. The horizon began to lighten faintly, the first hints of dawn painting the edges of the world in soft pastels. The night's reckoning had concluded, but the consequences, the lessons, and the vigilance it demanded remained as constant and enduring as the desert itself. By the time we returned to the ranch, the first pale light of morning had touched the rooftops, the corral, and the fields. The girls' parents were led to the safety of the main house, where they would rest and recover, their survival now a testament to patience, strategy, and courage. Luma and T remained close to me, their presence a reminder that the next chapter, though quieter, would require equal vigilance, even if it lacked the immediacy of gunfire and bloodshed. The morning light filtered through the windows of the ranch, soft and almost gentle, but I knew better. Light could illuminate, yes, but it could also reveal scars long buried, memories I had tried to lock away behind the gates of time. I walked through the house quietly, boots stirring the dust on the wooden floor, revolvers and rifles set aside, yet the weight of vigilance remained firmly upon my shoulders. The basin was behind us, the threat neutralized, but the past, my past, was never far. I went to the old study, the one room I had left untouched for years, where my wife's laughter and my son's small, restless footsteps still seemed to echo. The photographs, faded and worn, stared at me like ghosts from another life, another version of myself I no longer recognized. Every detail of that night replayed in my mind, the fire consuming the barn, the screams, the masks, the cold and lifeless eyes of my son. Pain had become a constant companion over the years, yet tonight's actions had shown me that it could be redirected, could serve a purpose beyond grief. The girls entered silently, their presence deliberate but unobtrusive. Luma had always carried a quiet strength, but today it was tempered with caution, a measured sense of responsibility I could not ignore. T remained as vigilant as ever, her eyes scanning every corner, her hands poised even in the absence of immediate danger. They had survived, yes, but more importantly, they had learned. And perhaps, in that learning, they had found a version of courage I had cultivated in isolation. I placed my hand on the table, tracing the grooves in the wood where I had carved initials and dates long forgotten. The past was tangible here, engraved in every surface, in every shadow, in every silence. The girls watched me, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and respect, as though they understood the weight of memory without needing to voice it. Words were often inadequate. Actions, however, could communicate volumes. We spoke little, for conversation seemed insufficient for the gravity of what had occurred. Instead, I began the process of preparation, gathering supplies, mapping out the perimeter, and ensuring that our defenses were intact. The girls assisted with precision, their movements efficient and deliberate. Luma checked the saddles and reins, ensuring the horses were ready, while T verified the locks and windows, a silent guardian ensuring no intrusion could catch us off guard. Yet even as we prepared for a semblance of normalcy, I felt the pull of unresolved memory. I walked alone to the edge of the corral, watching the sun rise over the northern plains. The golden light illuminated the ridges and valleys, each shadow a reminder of battles fought and victories earned, but also of loss and absence. The wind carried the faint scent of sagebrush and dust, the scent of a land that had been witness to both cruelty and resilience. The events of the basin replayed in my mind in vivid detail, the calculated movements, the precise shots, the coordination between Luma and T, and the eventual collapse of Brentwood's arrogance. It was a lesson in patience, in strategy, and in the enduring power of preparation. Yet the lesson was incomplete without reflection, without the acknowledgement that every action had been shaped by the wounds of the past. I found myself recounting the details to the girls, not as a retelling for their benefit, but as a method of confronting the memories I had carried alone for 20 years. They listened, absorbing the narrative without interruption, their presence a silent affirmation that understanding could be shared, that pain could be acknowledged and transformed into purpose. T, ever watchful, eventually broke the silence. Her voice, though calm, carried the weight of recognition. She understood that survival was not merely about escaping death, but about mastering the past, learning from it, and using it as a foundation for action. Luma nodded, her hands still busy with preparations, yet her eyes reflected a dawning comprehension of the lessons embedded in our ordeal. As the day progressed, I took stock of the ranch, our supplies, and our position. The girls moved with quiet efficiency, yet their presence reminded me that the future was no longer mine alone to navigate. The past had shaped me, yes, but the present demanded collaboration, foresight, and vigilance. Every shadow held possibility, every ridge could conceal danger, every open field required awareness. I allowed myself a rare moment to breathe, standing at the edge of the ranch, surveying the plains stretching toward the horizon. The wind whispered through the grasses, carrying the scent of distant fires and the faint echo of past voices. It was a reminder that life, though scarred, continued. The girls and their parents had survived because of strategy, patience, and courage, but also because I had endured. Even as I planned for the coming days, the basin, Brentwood, and the decoy box were never far from my thoughts. Their presence was a reminder that vigilance could never cease. The world had shifted, yes, and the immediate threat was gone, yet the lessons of survival demanded continuous attention. I began to map out potential scenarios, contingencies for threats both expected and unforeseen, ensuring that the legacy of our struggle would not be undone by negligence or overconfidence. By evening, the family gathered inside the house, the first semblance of calm settling over the ranch. I remained vigilant, yet I allowed myself a cautious sense of accomplishment. The girls, now more than mere protégés, had proven their resilience, courage, and understanding. Their parents, once fragile and fearful, were now grounded, reassured by the efficacy of strategy and the endurance of those who had protected them. As night fell, I stood alone at the edge of the porch, observing the stars scattered across the darkening sky. Each point of light felt like a reminder of decisions made, lives preserved, and justice meted with patience and precision. The basin was quiet, the horizon calm, yet I knew that the shadows of the past would always linger. They had shaped me, defined me, and now, with allies and survivors at my side, they would guide the next chapter of vigilance, protection, and the quiet assertion of control over a world that had once sought to take everything from me. The dawn broke with a muted light, filtered through a haze of dust and distant smoke from old fires lingering across the northern plains. I stood at the corral's edge, feeling the wind tug at my coat and stir the loose soil beneath my boots. Every ridge, every dip in the terrain, every shadow in the distance had been catalogued in my mind over the past weeks. I had walked these plains countless times, yet today the familiar lines of earth felt like a chessboard. The stakes were higher than they had ever been, the pieces sharper, more dangerous. Inside the house, the girls were awake before the sun fully climbed, their movements purposeful and precise. Luma was at the window, her hands adjusting the shutters to allow a sliver of light for visibility while keeping us concealed. T was inspecting the armory, checking the rifles, the revolvers, and the concealed caches of ammunition I had maintained since the day Brentwood first threatened us. They had learned fast, faster than I had anticipated, but it was more than just skill. It was the kind of instinct honed from fear, necessity, and survival. I moved quietly to the map on the table, tracing the canyon ridges, the dry basin, and the path Brentwood's men would likely take. My fingers pressed into the paper, following routes they could take, points where ambushes could occur, and potential spots for the decoy box. Every detail mattered. Every decision could mean life or death. The girls gathered behind me, observing silently, understanding that this was not a game but a matter of life and vengeance. 4 hours, we worked in silence. I instructed them on signals, timing, and contingencies. Luma would approach the basin with the decoy box, her demeanor fragile yet convincing. T would remain hidden, her eyes on both the box and the approaching threat, ready to intervene if necessary. I would position myself on the ridge, vantage perfect for overseeing the entire operation. It was a dance we had practiced in theory countless times, But today it had to become reality. The air smelled of sagebrush, dust, and distant water, carrying with it a strange sense of expectancy. The plains themselves seemed aware, as if the land had been holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. I moved between the barn, the corral, and the house, checking weapons, securing supplies, and ensuring the perimeter was impenetrable. Every detail mattered. Nothing could be left to chance. By midday, the sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the dry earth. I watched the girls as they moved among the horses and supplies, noting how their expressions had shifted from fear to focus, determination, and a quiet strength. They were no longer just survivors. They were participants in the culmination of a story that had started long before they were born. I took a moment to recall the events that had led to this point. The fire in the barn, the loss of my family, the betrayal, and the years of solitude. Everything had shaped me, honed my senses, sharpened my judgment. But it had also left a hollow space inside me, a void I had learned to carry silently. The presence of the girls, of their parents, had begun to fill some of that emptiness. Not entirely, but enough to remind me that life, even after loss, could contain fragments of purpose and connection. The afternoon passed with meticulous preparation. I ensured the horses were ready, their hooves shod and saddled, the tack cleaned and functional. Luma rehearsed her approach with the decoy box, her movements precise, her eyes scanning the horizon for the first sign of movement. T remained vigilant, her posture tense yet controlled, shadowing the perimeter with the quiet authority of someone who had seen death but refused to be dominated by it. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky with streaks of orange and crimson, I allowed myself a brief moment to stand at the ridge's edge. I surveyed the plains, the basin, and the distant canyon paths. Every potential route of approach was visible. Every shadow held meaning. I felt the weight of the rifle in my hands, the cold metal against my cheek, and the familiarity of preparation settled over me like a cloak. I had trained for this, thought through it, and yet there remained a kernel of uncertainty, a reminder that even the most careful plan could falter when confronted by human greed and desperation. Evening arrived with a hush. The family gathered briefly for sustenance, a simple meal, but the conversation was minimal, eyes and hands busy with final preparations. I could see the tension in Luma's shoulders, the vigilance in T's eyes, yet beneath it all lay a trust in the plan and in me. It was not blind trust. It was forged from necessity and proof of competence. And it was enough. As night fell fully, the stars emerged like scattered lanterns across the dark canvas of the sky. The plains were silent, yet the air thrummed with anticipation. I positioned myself in the shadow of a rock outcropping overlooking the basin, rifle in hand, eyes scanning every ridge and dip. Luma and T were in position, the decoy box ready, and the parents safely concealed. All that remained was the arrival of Brentwood and his men. The final act, the culmination of years of grief, preparation, and vengeance, was about to unfold. The wind shifted, carrying faint sounds from a distance. Footsteps, the creak of leather, and the faint jingle of metal warned of approaching danger. I adjusted my grip on the rifle, heart steady but senses acute. Every past mistake, every wound, every scar, the memory of my family, the basin, the betrayal, had led to this moment. The stage was set, the players in position. The storm was coming, and we would meet it not with hesitation, but with the precision, patience, and resolve forged from decades of survival. And in that quiet moment, watching the horizon darken with the approach of shadows, I realized something profound. Vengeance was not merely about retribution, it was about reclaiming life from the grip of the past. Tonight, the ghosts would confront the living, and the plains, silent witness to so much bloodshed, would bear witness once more. The night was dense, black as tar, the stars mere pinpricks in a vast, empty sky. I crouched behind the ridge, rifle ready, heart steady though every nerve screamed with anticipation. The plains below stretched endlessly, every shadow a potential threat, every whisper of the wind a messenger of danger. The time had come. Brentwood would arrive, and with him, the reckoning long postponed. From the basin below, the faint clatter of hooves and the dull scrape of boots on gravel carried upward. I adjusted my scope, focusing on the approaching figures. 4 men emerged first, pale-faced and sharp-eyed, the glint of polished boots catching the dim starlight. They moved cautiously, hands twitching toward weapons, scanning the terrain for ambushes they would not see. Behind them, Brentwood followed, his black duster flowing like smoke, the silver handle of his cane catching glimmers of moonlight as he strode with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. Luma and T were in position, the decoy box strapped carefully to the back of the mule. Their faces were streaked with dirt and sweat, eyes wide with tension yet controlled. They approached slowly, deliberately, every movement rehearsed, every step a part of the narrative we had painstakingly prepared. I counted the distance, memorized every angle, and waited for the moment to act. Timing would be everything. The first of Brentwood's men reached for the bag, their faces lighting up with the greed of expectation. Luma remained calm, hands steady on the mule, eyes meeting mine with a subtle nod. The decoy box was in motion, and the trap was set. I took a deep breath, feeling the cold steel of the rifle against my cheek, the weight grounding me in the moment. I could see the tension ripple through Brentwood as he approached, his confidence momentarily faltering, eyes scanning the basin for signs of the inevitable trap. Then it began. The first shot cracked through the night, the sound of metal on metal as my bullet shattered the rifle of a man who reached for the bag. Panic erupted. The remaining 2 men ducked behind boulders, hands fumbling for their weapons, movements jerky and uncoordinated. Brentwood cursed, his voice sharp and commanding, the first glimpse of fear breaking through his polished veneer. T moved silently, blade in hand, emerging from shadow to cut the ropes binding the old couple. The parents stumbled free, their eyes wide with fear and disbelief, but they did not falter. Luma guided them to safety behind a rocky outcrop, keeping the decoy box between them and Brentwood's men, the illusion perfect. The chaos of the moment was a symphony of survival, every step choreographed yet fluid, alive. Brentwood shouted, his cane raised as a makeshift weapon, the glint of silver catching moonlight like a blade. He lunged at the box, greed twisting his face into a mask of fury. I stayed hidden, watching, waiting for the precise instant. My finger rested lightly on the trigger, every breath measured. And then, the moment came. Brentwood's back was to me, the scar above his collarbone catching the light, the mark of old sins and unhealed wounds. I squeezed the trigger. The shot rang through the basin, echoing against rock and canyon like a bell tolling judgment. Brentwood staggered, faltering as if the past itself had struck him. T moved with the speed of a shadow, knife in hand, driving it deep into the unhealed wound. His knees buckled, and he fell, eyes wide with disbelief and fear. Luma and T didn't hesitate, dragging their parents behind the rocks, the decoy box still clutched between them. The remaining men scrambled, disoriented, their plans undone by precision, preparation, and the unexpected. I emerged from the shadows, rifle sweeping across the basin, a single warning shot cracking through the chaos. 2 more men fell, scrambling, tripping over each other in fear. Brentwood lay on the dirt, blood seeping into his expensive coat, the silver cane sliding from his fingers. My gaze did not waver. There was no triumph in this moment, no satisfaction, only the cold clarity of justice finally arriving at its appointed time. The dust settled slowly, the echoes of gunfire fading into the night. The plains were quiet again, save for the shallow, trembling breaths of those who had survived. I walked to the fallen man, revolver still in hand, eyes scanning the basin for threats that no longer existed. Brentwood's greed, his cruelty, his manipulation, all ended here. There would be no more suffering inflicted by him, no more terror, no more chains. Luma and T approached cautiously, hands still trembling, but faces lit with relief and newfound strength. Their parents were alive, free, and the threat that had haunted us for weeks had been neutralized. I gestured for them to stay behind me, ensuring they understood that danger could still linger, even when the immediate threat was gone. The basin, once a place of anticipation and tension, became a symbol of survival, of calculated courage, and of the power of preparation and trust. Night passed slowly, the stars a silent audience to the aftermath of vengeance. We moved quietly, tending to wounds, gathering supplies, and ensuring the area was secure. The story of the past, of betrayal, loss, and retribution, had reached its climax. But even as the first light of dawn touched the plains, I knew that survival was not merely about overcoming a single moment of violence. It was about carrying the lessons of the past forward, ensuring that those who survived would not be broken by fear or regret. By the time the sun fully rose, the basin was empty of adversaries, but full of memory. Every rock, every shadow, every whisper of wind seemed to hold the residue of the confrontation, the echo of choices made, bullets fired, and justice delivered. Luma and T, standing beside their parents, glanced at me with gratitude and quiet awe. For them, the night had been one of terror and courage intertwined, a testament to the endurance of spirit against greed and cruelty. I looked across the basin, the remnants of the conflict settling into the dust, and allowed myself a moment to breathe. The plan had worked. The threat had been neutralized. The past, once a relentless shadow, had been confronted and accounted for. And though the wounds of memory would never fully heal, the cycle of fear, of captivity, and of manipulation had been broken. The first light of morning crept over the horizon, painting the plains with pale gold and soft shadows. The basin was empty now, save for the remnants of chaos and the faint scent of gunpowder lingering in the cool air. I walked among the scattered rocks, rifle slung loosely at my side, taking in the scene. Brentwood's body had been removed by the sheriff's men who arrived hours ago, called by neighbors who heard the shots echo through the valley. Justice, official and silent, had come, but not in the way the law might have imagined. The sisters moved quietly, tending to their parents, their hands gentle, yet their eyes carried a fierceness born of what we had survived. Luma mounted a horse, brushing dust from its flanks, and looked out over the plains. T lingered with their parents, whispering words I couldn't understand, a language older than the valley, yet full of healing. I stayed back, letting them have the moment, knowing that our lives would never be exactly the same. 4 years I had carried the weight of loss. The night my wife and son were taken, the betrayal of the gang, the scars both on my back and in my memory. That burden had shaped me into a man who lived quietly, always watching, always waiting. But now, after the storm of gunfire and deception, I felt the first tentative flicker of something I had not known in decades. Release. Not happiness. Release. We returned to the ranch together, the terrain familiar, yet transformed in my mind by the events of the night. The house was quiet, the wind through the broken beams whispering secrets, reminding me of the nights I had spent alone in sorrow. Luma and T settled their parents in the rooms nearest the hearth, and I made my way to the barn. The tools and weapons of survival were still there, my rifles, the Colt revolvers, and even the old black duster coat. I ran my fingers over them, feeling the weight of history, of every fight, every bullet fired in defense of life and justice. The sisters approached quietly. Luma placed a hand on my shoulder, her eyes reflecting the gratitude and understanding that words could not convey. T handed me a small bundle, the real box, wrapped in cloth as it had been all those years. The map inside was still intact, its lines faded but unmistakable. I held it in my hands, feeling the pulse of history, the legacy of greed and survival etched into every crease. "This is yours," Luma said softly, "but not for vengeance. For remembering." Her voice carried the wisdom of someone who had seen fear and defiance in equal measure, and had emerged stronger. T nodded beside her, silent, yet resolute. I nodded back. I understood. The past could not be changed, the lives lost could not be returned, but the future could be guided. The ranch would continue, the plains would endure, and perhaps, finally, there would be peace. As the sun rose higher, I mounted my horse, feeling the familiar weight in my hands, the steady rhythm of hooves against the earth. Luma and T rode beside me, their parents following at a safe distance, and together we moved across the valley, not as captives or victims, but as survivors. The wind carried no whispers of fear, only the promise of a day unshadowed by revenge. I glanced at the sisters, then at the horizon. For the first time in 20 years, I felt unburdened. The cycle of violence had ended. The basin was behind us, the ghosts laid to rest. And as we rode into the sunlight, I realized that the measure of a man was not in how long he endured sorrow, but in how he rose to protect what remained, and how he allowed others to rise with him. The plains stretched endlessly ahead, open and forgiving. I knew we would carry scars, and memories that would never fade, but they no longer defined us. Together, we had faced the shadows of the past and survived. And in that survival, in the quiet strength of the new day, there was hope. If you were in his place, facing the ghosts of the past and the enemy of a lifetime, would you fight the same battle? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video.